Welcome to the Vine Resources Podcast Show with your host, David Lawrence.
Welcome to another edition of the Vine Resources Podcast Show. I'm absolutely delighted today to have with us Andrew Robinson. Andrew is the CEO of Groundspeed Analytics in the USA, very close to Detroit in Ann Arbor. Thanks for joining me, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Pleased to be able to join.
I'd love to share with our listeners a little bit about your company because some really interesting stuff you're doing there in the insurance market. Can you share a little bit of background about who you are and what your company does at Groundspeed, please?
Yeah, sure. We're a 3-year-old company. At our core, we're a data sciences and an AI company focused exclusively on the commercial property and casualty industry, which globally is about an $800 billion market. And functionally, where we focus is in commercial insurance, where information, particularly related to the evaluation, selection, and pricing and placing of risk, involves a great deal of unstructured information. And what we're doing is we're focused on making sense of much of that unstructured information that moves around between the insured, the broker, and the carrier. And applying technology to bring structure to that information, to be able to enrich that information, to drive valuable predictive analytics that inform risk selection and pricing from that information. And in our 3 years, we've had some good success, as evidenced by a business that's grown to about 75 people. We've gone through 2 institutional rounds of fundraising. We completed a $30 million Series B fundraise last year, which was the single largest insurtech and enterprise solution fundraise for all of 2018. So in a short period of time, it's gone well, and we're really confident we focus on a problem that really matters for our clients.
Well, we'll come on to that problem in a minute, and thanks for that introduction. And I know you have around about 80 people in the company and growing fast. You've got customers in obviously in the US, in Europe, UK, and Australia. I know Aon is a customer of yours. Public information. I know a great video on your website. In fact, just out of interest. If for our listeners who are listening to this, tell me the problems that you're solving.
Yeah, so I think at the most fundamental level, if you take commercial insurance and you sort of separate out small commercial, for which I think there's some really interesting developments happening around, trying to create a truly digital experience. As you get to any account or any kind of risk that has I would just describe more substance to it. So things that people might reference as middle market or large market or specialty risk. The information that the industry uses to be able to make sense of that risk, to be able to evaluate, to ultimately price it, that information, claims information about the risk, which is referred to as exposure information, the customer information, much of that information is moved around in ways that is highly unstructured. And it's highly unstructured because the diversity of what you're dealing with, whether it be around a specific industry line of business or a class of business, let's say you're dealing with construction versus dealing with hospitality, the diversity of information has been a challenge for the industry, and as a result, the industry really has never landed on standards, and is not likely to land on standards. So we start with that problem that said there's this tremendous heterogeneity of information, and so if you can insert yourself into the middle of that process and be able to use machine intelligence to make sense of that, structure it into the forms that ultimately, both brokers and carriers want to consume it. That's a really important problem to solve in terms of just shortening, the cycle time and reducing costs. But further, if you do that well, and you build a sort of an information base from that, there's a lot of value that you can add in terms of what kind of enrichments and predictions you can augment to that data that then can be used by brokers and carriers for their benefit. And so that's it. That's really the problem that we're focused on.
Fantastic. And you mentioned there very briefly about standards, and it's difficult, or maybe it hasn't happened yet where there's a global standards. Why is that?
Well, look, I do think that it's a really complex problem, given the diversity of the kind of data that runs across the entire industry. I mean, there are green shoots of things, right? In the United States, ISO, which is the industry standards organization, which is now a commercial entity in the form of Verisk. Accord applications. There are standards, but those standards are only in dealing with certain aspects of the information about risk and in certain lines of business. And anytime that something new is created, things are created because there actually is an entrepreneurial feature to the industry. And so, people will create forms, whether they're applications or contracts or other things that are responsive to that market. And just the industry has not moved in terms of providing, structure to the data. And I think that we're past a point where you would want to try to rewind and create standards. I think that we're at a point where technology actually can solve the problem without having to create standards. And so in that regard, we think we're well placed.
Fantastic. Andrew, we're going to jump into some of the questions now. I'd love to know a little bit about, for our listeners, what does a typical day look for you as one of the co-CEOs?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We've Jeff Mason, my co-founder, he's very much the entrepreneur and very much kind of the product visionary and has grabbed a hold of that. And I come from the industry, and so take sort of the operations and the commercial side of the business. And I would just tell you there is no typical day. It's an immensely diverse set of activities, as I'm sure it is for most senior leaders. In my case, I'm actively immersed in client activities, which means I'm traveling and working with prospects and clients who we're in production with. But I spend every second week, either in Atlanta or in Ann Arbor, where our two principal offices are, and the bulk of our resources, bulk of our team are in Ann Arbor. And much of what I'm doing is I'm spending time with our team, really trying to make sure that we're clear around sort of our critical priorities, and importantly that our resources are allocated and that everybody shares in understanding of what's really important. And that kind of leadership from the top is critically important given the speed that we're moving and the amount of change that we might see in any given month. And so I think probably between those two things, they overwhelm my agenda. But every day there's something new that I'm dealing with that I have not dealt with in the past.
Well, but that's great, and that represents a fantastic challenge as well. Can you name perhaps someone who's had an impact on you as a leader? I know obviously you've been in the industry for a long time, or in professional business, but who perhaps has been a mentor to you, and how have they impacted you?
Yeah, I listen. I spent 10 years building a consultancy from scratch that then was taken public and then acquired by PwC when they re-entered the consulting business. And the founder of that business, a fellow named Mel Bergstein, was a really interesting fellow who was first and foremost deeply focused on culture, and secondarily had a vision right from the get-go, which is that ownership should be distributed, and anybody who's critical to basically driving aspects of the business needs to be properly vested in that company. And so much of how he approached building that company, which was a wildly successful company, ultimately acquired by PwC, that philosophy has carried with me. And I'm 13 years removed from that. That's carried with me, and that has had a critical impact in terms of how it is that we're trying to build our business at Groundspeed. I think the second was just spent 11 years at Hanover Insurance Group. The CEO Fred Eppinger, who sits on our board, but also sits on the board of QBE and Centene and global 100 companies. I've never seen somebody who's so vision led in their in their sort of approach to the business, and very much a person who basically says, we need to be clear in our vision, and our resources need to be allocated towards that, and incredibly disciplined in that regard. And I would just say that's probably the second, key influencer in terms of how I think about the way that we need to grow our business at Groundspeed.
You mentioned there, obviously, culture is obviously very, very important. I'm curious now, was in the past at your previous company, of course, but I'm interested about the employee engagement bit. So what are you doing from the top in the organization to keep everyone engaged in the business?
Yeah, so, the first thing is, there's an approach that was sort of created within Intel, has been grabbed by the VC community, that uses an idea called OKRs, which, is objectives and key results. And we were slightly fanatical about, publishing those every quarter so that we have people aligned around it. But what's really interesting is that, part of our OKRs focus on culture and so forth. So, we're only a 3-year-old company, but at the beginning of this year, we did our first employee engagement survey. We used that as a sort of a critical input into getting our staff fully engaged in things that really were important to them. And I'll give you one simple example. Our staff, independent of us, grabbed a hold of the mission and values, and what they came up with values was their statements, not management statements. And I will just tell you, it was not anything that I would have expected, but it really reflects, the culture of our company. They organize their thinking around this notion of PEGs, which stands for, stands for positivity, effort, growth, and selflessness. And within that is their statements about what they value. And to have that kind of development come from within the organization, I think that's a real statement of culture. You get people bound into things that are about how they express what's important to us. And that started from kind of an OKR process where, we're focused on, on developing our culture, to people grabbing a hold of a critical topic, to developing it themselves. And so it's a really organic thing inside of our company. And in 3 years, there is a culture that is, I think it's much more a statement about our people, and it's about a statement of what I'm trying to create.
What do you see now as the biggest challenge facing business leaders in today's market?
Oh boy, that's really interesting. I'm not sure that I can talk about it generically, but I'll tell you, in the world of insurance, I've been a consultant to the industry for 20 years. I've been a corporate leader for 10 years, and now doing some really interesting entrepreneurial things. And there's a whole bunch of attributes that are playing out related to new capital coming in. It's been playing out over the last 10 years. But the sort of the moment of technological change, and I would say the democratization of things like AI technology, entirely new, big swaths of data are available, and all that stuff implies, I think, a moment in time of change in the organization. And I tell you, it's whether you're a provider, solution provider like us, or whether you're on the corporate side, trying to sort of navigate that and ensure that you're spending your time on the things that matter, it's a unique challenge that I think it's always present, but it just feels like at this moment in time, that kind of being clear on what's important and allocating your resources, and then mobilizing folks to actually make progress on those things that are important. It just feels like the stakes are incredibly high right now, as compared to my experience maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Andrew, what's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Oh boy, there's one that stands out, which is I'm an aggressive thinker. I think I'm an aggressive leader and a directed kind of person. And somebody who was very much focused on coaching CEOs said to me, intent versus impact are two very different things, and reminded me that there's so much of what I do that the intent might be good and right, but the impact it has on people might not be aligned with my intent, and being able to sort of separate those two things and being deeply conscious of those two things will improve me as a leader, and it most certainly has. And I've actually taken that little thing, and I've used it as a tool with people who have reported to me, so that their awareness is better, and as it just had profound impact on me personally.
Now, you also mentioned earlier, of course, that you sold your company to PwC. By the way, that's an amazing achievement to exit the business successfully. I'm just wondering if there's one piece of advice there, that one thing that stood out for you, if someone was perhaps trying to get to that point or even going through that, what advice would you give them?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough question. Look, I think that starting a company, building a company, selling a company, all those things are in themselves. They're big undertakings, right? And I don't think you go into, like, people ask me all the time, like, what's the end game for Groundspeed? And I'm like, I don't know, right? Today we're focused on a particular problem. We're trying to build the best company we possibly can around that problem. I think that ultimately the decision to continue to be independent or sell, that's very situational. I very much think that anybody who's thinking about exit as they're building a business is thinking about things the wrong way. We're thinking about building a great business and building the best products we possibly can, and and sort of the problem set that we're trying to solve. That's our focus, and if we do that well, options will be available to us. And so my advice is much more about the focus on building great businesses, and everything else will fall into place.
Brilliant, that's great advice there. So how at Groundspeed, how do you help a new employee understand the culture of the business?
Boy, I tell you, I don't think that we have a formula around it. I go back to what I shared with you earlier, which is the way that our staff has created, kind of their statements of what we value, and so I think it's very much an organic thing. We are looking for diversity, so people will come in and our culture actually is not, it's not we don't look at culture as being kind of a static thing. We look at culture as being a very organic thing, and we're looking for diversity and for people who can contribute. So I'm not sure we want to mold people into our culture. We do want people who value the same things that we value, right? This notion that positivity is a choice, right? We'll screen people for that. This notion of, growth comes in a lot of different forms, including growth of your teammates as well as yourself. We'll screen people who share those values, but once they match those values, we want people to help shape our culture, right? And I got great examples of that, right? We have an engineer who's basically stepped forward, and he's the person who independently said, we have to have a summer outing. I need funding. I'm organizing it. And we're all about people grabbing a hold of that, and now that summer outing will become part of our our regular rhythm and so forth. That's how we think about culture. We just want to hire for people who share our value set, and then let them influence and develop our culture.
Fantastic. Andrew, is there a story perhaps from your childhood that influenced your work ethic in later life?
There's not a story, but I think, listen, I proudly talk about this all the time. My parents are children of Eastern European immigrants to New York City. They were the first to be educated. Both my parents, won scholarships to prestigious New York City high schools. They both went on to get their PhDs on full scholarships. And it's a phenomenal story, what both have achieved. And, it's just, I think that when you have parents who do that and, basically take themselves from they weren't living in poverty, but they certainly had, about the most modest kind of childhood you could possibly have, and kind of, grew up to have, both great careers, but also, educationally just achieve at the highest level, that, that has an impact. It's had an impact on me. It's had an impact on my sisters. It certainly has an impact on my kids. And, that just permeates kind of part of who we are as a family. I'm very, very proud of my parents, and, and it has had a tremendous impact on me personally.
What do you think the business and particularly the insurance industry that you're in, the area, what do you think it's going to look like in 5 years' time?
That's a great question, and this is something I do have a point of view on. Whether it's 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, or I think we already see the sort of the green shoots of this. But I historically, the industry was made up of big, made up of insurance carriers who had balance sheets and had ratings and so forth. I think the entire structure of the industry evolves in a way where you have capital providers that may or may not be traditional insurance companies. You have companies that provide the means to get access to risk and can transform that via underwriting and other electronic techniques to be able to access capital. And that kind of disaggregation of the industry, we're seeing that today. I think that becomes a structural change that has huge implications for how the industry will work, the regulation of the industry, how the capital behind the industry will be structured, and technology is and what's happening with technology today is a massive accelerant for that, and to the point where we will see property and casualty risk traded as if it were an asset class like other kinds of asset classes. And I believe that that's something that we will start to see in 5 years' time, and it will be mature in 10 years' time.
If there was one, or if you had your time again and you were giving your 20-year-old self advice, what's the one thing you'd say to yourself now looking back?
Well, first off, I wouldn't change anything, right? I think I've actually probably achieved more than I ever thought I would achieve. I graduated with an engineering degree and went straight into strategy consulting, and I took a bunch of risks, got a chance to live internationally for a large portion of my life. I married a Brit and still married her today, raised 2 great kids. And I've had a great career. So none of those things I'd change. I think the only thing that I would ever change about how things have developed is that if you're so focused on your career and the progress in your career, you're not enjoying the journey as much as you could. And I think that's true in some aspects of my personal life. It's certainly true in aspects of my professional life. If I could rewind the tape, I wouldn't change any of the things that have occurred. I would have taken time to enjoy much more of the experiences. So don't just enjoy crossing the finish line. Enjoy the process of getting to the finish line. And that's probably the one thing I would say I would change.
Fantastic. Andrew, thanks for sharing the insight with us. If people want to find out more about the company, connect with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, so the company, probably the simplest way is just our website, which is groundspeed.com, and reaching me personally is the other way, and that's pretty straightforward. It's just andrew.robinson@groundspeed.com, and certainly would love to hear from anybody who's interested in talking to us.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate your time, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
We really hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're listening to this on iTunes, please take a moment to give us a review. 4 stars would be good, but 5 stars would be amazing.